Communication. It's one of those topics that's routinely so scorchingly hot that I don't blame people who soak in sunscreen to avoid getting burnt to a crisp. G'day mates and fellow adventurers, my name is Mordecai. Communicating with other people can be fairly hard yakka, with obstacles such as misunderstanding what has been said, misinterpreting statements to mean something else entirely, and sometimes unintentionally adding extra meaning to things said. It's part of what makes communicating with other people a skill set, one which also both directly benefits and can be based on the ability to roleplay characters at the table, which is exactly why communication with others is exactly that. Based. But sometimes you run into a person who struggles with communication, and it can be unclear whether or not they are genuinely struggling, or if they don't really care about communication. Regardless of which of these applies to the particular person, this can lead to problems for other people, especially at the role-playing table, and particularly if there are pre-existing issues that need to be resolved. Before we get started with the story for the video, if I get to 1000 subs before the end of 2023, I have plans to cover an RPG story which predates the subreddit and contains one of the most infamous characters in all of tabletop role-playing game history. Let's delve into the often terrifying world of r/RPGHorrorStories. Today's narrative is titled, I wouldn't call him a problem player, but... and is written by user Vokusu. People of the internet, I request some advice. I want to start off with a bit of background. I am a DM, and my playstyle is very heavy on roleplay and characters. Of course, I figured this out over time by joining different groups with different players, and learning what I liked more than other things. I am very lucky to have found a group that has the same level of commitment type of love for this game that I do. My first attempt at running Curse of Strahd was a disaster, and none of the players wanted the same thing out of a game. It definitely taught me a lot though. There was one player who was far more into roleplay than the rest of the group. We'll call this player Ferris. I liked that he was happy to roleplay, so when I found a new group on LFG, I invited him to join again. A lot of the players from the LFG group ended up not being so into the roleplay side of things, so they mostly left by the third session. We had more players join in though. These players were invested in their characters and relationships, and they liked to roleplay, a lot more than Ferris did. Ferris stayed with the group, but I noticed that as the other players roleplayed more, he began to ignore the game more. He was never super into the mechanical side of things, but it became like pulling teeth just to ask him to look at his new class abilities when he leveled up. Another thing about Ferris is that he is awful at communication. For the first few months of the campaign, he showed up anywhere between 10 minutes to half an hour late to the sessions. I had a talk with him about it. The next session, we waited for him for an entire hour, messaging him, and I even asked one of his friends to message him. We heard nothing, not even a peep. The next day, I had scheduled to see a movie with Ferris and some of his friends. When I arrived at the mall, neither I or his friends had heard anything from him. It wasn't until one of his friends was getting in the car to pick him up that he had finally admitted that he had been in the hospital since the previous day for a stomach problem. I understand that emergencies happened, but he had been awake with access to his phone the whole time, and hadn't told anyone until the very last minute. If it had just been the D&D group that he hadn't told, I'd get it since he'd basically been freshly admitted to the hospital at that point. But he waited until noon the next day to tell the person who was supposed to be his driver. We were all pretty peeved about that. After that, he started showing up on time to sessions. Unfortunately, the coordination only lasted about a week. A session later, the party arrived at Argenvolstholt, and 2 rooms in, he abruptly leaves the voice chat. We all sat in silence for a minute before he messages, I have an appointment to go to. It sort of hit the party all at once how annoying this lack of communication was, and the rest of the session was spent in a dismal mood. The rest of the party is very good about warning me at least a day ahead of time when they have an appointment, so it was upsetting that he wasn't putting in the same amount of care that the rest of the party were. The players agreed that we needed to have a talk again. I was busy throughout the week, and the next session ended up being very stressful and emotional, but that's a horror story for another time. So I decided to wait a week to avoid any extra stress. This brings us up to Friday. Before the session, I was chatting casually with a player, and they mentioned that Ferris had said that he was interviewing for a job. He'd expressed to them that if he got it, which he was quite sure he would, it would likely interfere with the session time. Again, I felt the annoyance at his lack of communication. Any excuse I'd made for him before went out of the window. It's not like it wasn't on his mind. He had said this to a player whilst in the game's server's voice chat. He wasn't busy, he'd been playing games with his other friends all week. I was genuinely annoyed, and I asked him to stay after the session. I even wrote out talking points to be sure I would clearly get my thoughts across to him. I made it clear that I wasn't mad that he was doing things in his life, but that it wasn't fair to me or the other players for them all to put in the same level of commitment, only for him to not even bother to tell me when he knew he might not be available ahead of time. During our conversation, he revealed to me more about his feelings about the campaign. For context, I had made it very clear in Session 0 that it was a serious campaign, and that I wanted serious characters. He explained yesterday that he wasn't talking much during the sessions anymore because the current story wasn't about him, and that his character was just a meme. His words, not mine. I tried to explain to him that the campaign is about the party, and even if the current arc isn't strictly focused on his character, he is still an important part of the party. The rest of the players put in weeks of work into their characters, whereas he didn't even have more than 2 sentences in his backstory. I switched the conversation to focus more on that since it seemed to be the real root of the problem. He made his character a joke when the rest of the party was seriously invested, and by doing so, he was excluding himself, which gave me little choice but to focus on the players who had put in so much more effort. I gave Ferris a choice. Either flesh out his character so he could feel more like part of the group, make an entirely new character, or leave. I even offered to introduce him to one of my old DMs, whose playstyle was, admittedly, much closer to his. He asked if he could get back to me with his decision on Saturday night, since we play on Sundays as well. I'd hoped I'd been clear in our conversation. His answer was that he wanted to change his character's spells to be more support-focused. By that point, I knew he hadn't understood what I meant. I tried again, explaining that the spells weren't the problem, that the issue was how he treated his character as a meme in a serious campaign, and that he clearly wanted a more relaxed game. We came to an agreement, and he'd said he'd try to step up to the rest of the party. I'm giving him one more chance today. I'm stressed and racked with guilt, wondering if I did the right thing. I love my players so much, and they've put in so much work. It doesn't feel fair to them for there to be a player who doesn't care as much as they do. At the end of the day, yeah, I find it slightly annoying, but I'd put up with it because I fear confrontation. I don't want to kick him because he seems to want to play, but this group is precious to me, and I want them to have the most amount of fun they can. I don't have anything against different playstyles, but everyone in the group wants the same type of game except for him. This is part rant and part me begging for a more experienced DM to give me some kind of advice. What if he doesn't show any sign of change? Could I have handled this differently? Could I have handled it better? In summary, all but one of my players are very committed to a rather serious campaign, whereas the last player just wants to meme around. I don't know if I dealt with this player in the right way or not. In the time since the original post, a number of Reddit villagers came forth with various bits of advice, and the Sunday session went ahead. In the comments afterward, OP had this to say as part of the aftermath. Thanks everyone for your advice. I sat down with the rest of the players and they agreed that he was draining their fun as well. We were all pretty hesitant to lose yet another player, especially since he was the only remaining character from Session 1, he's been kicked from the group, and hopefully things will start looking up from here. And that's where the story ends. From his comment about how the story wasn't currently about his character, it's rather clear that Ferris wanted to be the main character without putting in any additional effort on his part, which is normally indicative of a problem commonly referred to as main character syndrome, where a player does heaps of hogging the spotlight. But instead of putting any effective effort into his character so that he could earn that spotlight on occasion, he put his yakka into doubling down on his joke of a character, and misunderstanding what OP was trying to communicate. Perhaps not intentionally, but it's hard to say for certain without more information. Although it does sound as though Ferris wasn't as invested into the game as he could have been from the start. It is worth mentioning that a joke character can work in a serious campaign, but not without some effort to make the party member work. For instance, having a character who is happy-go-lucky can cause a serious party of edgelords to cheer up from a rather depressing scene. And you can't forget the possibility of having your character be the comedic relief for the party. The problem so far as players like Ferris are concerned is that any of these mean characters would require work to be put into them. Aspects such as why the character chooses to be a fun person to be around, and why they prioritize the morale and happy spirits of the gang is just one of the considerations for where yakka needs to be done for the character. So this would be the point where I talk about how OP has actually done the right thing by trying to communicate with Ferris and get the situation resolved. But some of you may have noticed that the way the story is written, and based on the Aftermath comment, that there is an implication that Ferris didn't get that opportunity to step up his game to match the other players like he said he would attempt to. We get no further word on whether or not Ferris got to play that last session with the players before getting kicked. Prior to that comment, I would emphasize that OP has done everything that he could be reasonably expected to do in that situation. But with the way that the comment is written, it admittedly has me a little suspicious of OP. With that, I do actually have some advice for players who find themselves in a similar situation. My first piece of advice would be to attempt to teach players like Ferris how and when to properly communicate with others, since that is an essential lifelong skill. It would assist with figuring out if the particular player is trolling, or is actually in need of serious aid. The second piece of additional advice would be to potentially consider collaborating in a live environment with the player to help flesh out the existing character, or any new characters they might play. And if they somehow don't take up the mantle, do feel free to point them in the direction of a different campaign that would be more suitable to their particular playstyle, if that is feasible. Perhaps my last piece of advice would be that if you somehow suspect that the player is in need of serious mental help, remember that D&D is no substitute for genuine therapy, even if it can have some therapeutic value. Thank you for watching the video. If you like my content and want to see more or wish to support the channel, please hit the subscribe button and maybe leave the video a like. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Also, if you wish to leave a comment but can't think of anything to write, let me know you've reached the end of the video by commenting, "Talk to us, we want to help." Again, thank you for watching, and I shall see you all next time.